Section 1 of The National Geographic Magazine, Volume 7, March 1896. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in March 2016. The so-called Jeannette Relics by Professor William H. Dall. Much interest has been excited by the recent rumor that news had been received from Nansen via Siberia. In discussing the rumor, I mentioned that the supposed relics of the Jeannette found off Julianehaab in Greenland were in all probability in no way connected with the Jeannette expedition, but were due to a boyish prank of some of the members of the Greely relief expedition of 1884. In attempting to formulate his expressions of an interview with me during which the subject was discussed, and which were not revised by me, the reporter unfortunately fell into some inaccuracies, not unnatural in a person unfamiliar with the technicalities of Arctic exploration, but for which the telegrams to the press made me responsible. It seems desirable, therefore, to lay before those interested in such matters a statement of the facts bearing on the two questions involved, namely, were the relics really derived from the Jeannette expedition? And, if not, were they the result of a mystification as above suggested? The first is of course the only one of importance to geographers, for if the relics were spurious, it matters but little whence they were derived. The facts are now in order. 1. The Jeannette sank June 11, 1881, in the Arctic Sea, about 180 miles northwest from the New Siberian Islands. 2. The Greely relief expedition of 1884 reached the coast of Greenland in May. The Bear met the pack ice near Godhavn about May 13, the Thetis and Loch Garry May 22nd, the Alert on June 5th. The latter left Godhavn June 9 and reached Upernivik June 13. 3. On June 18, some Eskimo found on the surface of an ice floe off Julianehaab in southwest Greenland some articles which were turned over to the Danish officer in charge of that settlement, HerrlePeter, who sent them to a friend in Copenhagen. These comprised, among other things, some broken biscuit boxes, a pair of oilskin trousers, said to have been marked Louis Noros, the name of one of the Jeannette survivors who was a member of the Greely relief expedition of 1884, and a number of written papers, especially a list of the boats of the Jeannette, and a list of provisions signed by DeLong, the commander of the Jeannette expedition, and stated to be entirely in his or a single handwriting. 4. The Greely relief expedition left Greenland from Godhavn July 9 without touching at Julianehaab. 5. In the latter part of the winter of 1884 through 85, a Danish correspondent wrote to Dr. Emil Bessels, formerly of the Polaris expedition and a well-known Arctic expert, at Washington, stating that news of these various relics had been received in Copenhagen and requesting his opinion as to their authenticity. The substance of this letter was communicated to me by Dr. Bessels, who was much interested in the find, as, if genuine, it obviously furnished important data toward a knowledge of the drift in the polar regions. The presence in Washington during 1885 of many members of the relief expedition in connection with the various investigations which followed their return enabled Dr. Bessels to interview many of the seamen as well as their officers, and to accumulate a large mass of notes from his examination of them. On one or two occasions I was invited to be present when some of these men called on Dr. Bessels. The well-known tendency of articles on the surface of ice, under the influence of the sun, to sink through it to the level of the water, even such trifles as birds' feathers or dead leaves being rapidly engulfed, as I have often personally noticed, led to doubts as to the possibility of the articles mentioned having remained on the surface of the ice for 3 years during a drift of 3,000 miles, exposed to the elements. The possibility of the preservation of written papers under such conditions seemed almost incredible. The close approximation of the dates of the presence of the relief expedition on the West Greenland coast and that of the finding of the relics was also suspicious. The testimony of the seamen interviewed was, in brief, to the effect that the presence of Jeannette survivors on the relief expedition had suggested to someone the possibility of producing a sensation in the fleet which for some time followed the foremost vessels, that in a spirit of boyish levity this hoax was conceived and carried out, with no intention of serious deception or thought of the possible consequences. No names were mentioned, and the evidence was to the effect that a general impression prevailed among the men that some such prank had been played, rather than that any particular man questioned was personally cognizant of the act. Dr. Bessels gathered an amount of evidence tending to support this hypothesis, which he showed me and which covered 40 or 50 pages of foolscap. This record was afterward burned, with his library and other papers, in a fire which destroyed his residence at Glendale, D.C. In consequence, Dr. Bessels communicated to his European correspondents his belief that the relics were fictitious and the result of a hoax. I stated to Dr. Rink and others who inquired of me the same conclusions. 6. In 1888, Dr. Nansen made his celebrated journey across Greenland and presumably heard of the relics there. Before his return, Dr. Bessel died in Germany, where he had taken up his residence. Up to this time, either the doubts which had been thrown on the authenticity of the relics, or some other reason, had prevented them from exciting much interest, and the owner seems to have resisted any attempt to verify their authenticity by sending photographs or originals of the papers to America when requested. The papers and other objects were placed in a box in a garret, and, after the death of the owner, were burned as worthless, with the acquiescence of the widow. As HerrlePeter had published an account of them, Geographic Tidskrift, 8, 1885-88, pages 49-51, and the finder and possessor alike acted in perfect good faith throughout, it is probable that after Dr. Bessel's opinion was communicated to him, the owner attached no great value to the objects, otherwise his wife would hardly have been ignorant of it. When Dr. Nansen endeavored to examine these objects with a view of determining their authenticity, they were no longer in existence. One of his friends, whose name has slipped my memory and whose letter is temporarily inaccessible, wrote to me on Nansen's behalf, as he explained, asking my opinion, which was sent some time before the starting of Nansen's latest expedition. Baron Nordenskjöld was also informed some time before Nansen sailed, so that there is no doubt that Nansen was cognizant of the fact that the authenticity of the relics was seriously questioned. He had previously admitted as much in his paper above cited, but did not on that account relax his faith in them. Conclusions. It is evident that the proof that the relics were the result of a hoax is not complete, and, in the nature of things, unless the parties actually concerned shall admit it, is never likely to be completed. Each person will form his own opinion from the data submitted. I have spent some 10 years of my life at sea, nearly half of the time in command of a United States surveying vessel, and I am quite aware of the nature of sailor men and sailors' evidence. Dr. Bessels was for years my intimate and valued friend and associate, and in all our intercourse nothing ever occurred to lead me to doubt his earnest endeavor to get at the truth of this matter. My own conclusions are, first, that the relics were not authentic, and, second, that they were probably due to a hoax, as stated above. In support of the first conclusion, beside the data given, the probability that de Long himself would be writing out receipts for stores is very small. There has been since 1848 an average of 2 or 3 ships a year lost in the ice north of Bering Strait, and in the vicinity of the point where the Jeannette entered the pack. Not a single relic of all the enormous fleet of over 100 wrecks has ever been identified on the Greenland coast, where wood has always been of the greatest value. Driftwood from northern rivers is cast up on the Greenland coast more or less every year, but there is no evidence that it comes from points east of Nova Zembla. It is not impossible that some of it does, but it cannot be proved. Some 20-odd years ago a throwing stick, of the pattern used at Port Clarence near Bering Strait, came ashore on the coast of Greenland near Godhaab, and was presented to the museum at Christiania by Dr. Rink. When one remembers how the crews of whale ships collect curios which they carry to all parts of the world, and which are often thrown away or lost in the most unexpected places, the certainty that this stick drifted from Port Clarence, a distance of not less than 4,000 miles, is evidently not to be taken for granted. I have received from lagoons on the west side of the peninsula of Lower California, formerly frequented by whalers, marine shells unquestionably of North European origin, Buccinum undatum especially, which is not known in the Pacific at all, and I have also received Indo-Pacific species, as well as coconut shells, collected by John Murdoch, from the shores of the Arctic Ocean north of Bering Strait. That the drift of the Jeannette was due to the prevalent winds is beyond question, as already shown by Melville, and as may be worked out by anybody from the data. That, if continued, it would have passed across the pole, as argued by Nansen, is a pure assumption, though a very enticing one. Certainly no one interested in Arctic work but must most heartily wish that that courageous explorer may succeed in proving his hypothesis and return in safety to claim the laurels his success would earn. In regard to the second point, that of the origin of the so-called relics, if regarded as fictitious, I have already stated my conclusion that the story of the hoax seems sufficient to account for them. To be perfectly impartial, however, one must admit that the currents about southwest Greenland are such that objects set adrift on the ice from any great distance to the northward of Julianehaab would usually be set over to the westward rather than inshore, although this general rule is subject to exceptions due to strong westerly winds. This fact alone, I suspect, was sufficient to satisfy Nansen, whose hypothesis was already framed. But it must be remembered that the Greenland current does not round Cape Farewell with equal strength at all seasons of the year, that the advent of the relief expedition was exceptionally early, the influx into Baffin's Bay had not begun, and that along such a coast as that of Greenland, eddies and reverse currents cannot fail to occur. While not without weight, I cannot assign to Nansen's objection sufficient weight to overcome the other indications, which for me, at least, lead to the conclusion that the so-called Jeannette relics have not been shown to have any certain connection with the Jeannette expedition. Furthermore, there is no certainty that the Alaskan throwing stick was brought to the coast of Greenland by oceanic currents, and even if it was, the time occupied in the transit and the route are alike absolutely unknown, so that speculations as to a drift across the region of the pole receive from this incident no positive confirmation. Admiral Sir E. Inglefield, the distinguished Arctic traveller, at the meeting of the Royal Geographical Society, called to discuss Nansen's plans, told of finding a fresh stick of Siberian pine, with the bark still upon it, and which seemed to have been only a few months in the water, on the west shore of Wellington Channel, which enters Baffin's Bay from the west. If such a tree could be carried eastward in a few months from Siberia to a point accessible by ships from Baffin's Bay, why is it not more probable that this throwing stick, lost near Port Clarence, was carried north and east by the well-known northeasterly shore current past Point Barrow, and so on to Baffin's Bay and the Greenland coast? At this meeting such Arctic authorities as Admiral Sir George Nares, Captain Wharton, Hydrographer R.N., ex-Hydrographer Sir George Richards, R.N., and Sir Joseph Hooker united in the opinion that nothing was known about the direction or existence of sea currents in the region Nansen hoped to traverse, and that all opinions in regard to them must be purely speculative. The doubtful character of the so-called Jeannette relics was also distinctly pointed out. It cannot be said, therefore, that Nansen pursued his plans in ignorance of the doubtful elements of his hypothesis, but rather that his courage, energy, and audacity were such that he was willing to risk everything to put his speculations to a final test. End of section 1.
Section 2 of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 7, March 1896. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nansen's Polar Expedition by General A. W. Greely, Chief Signal Officer, United States Army. The continuing interest of the unsolved polar mystery has been strikingly illustrated by the eagerness with which the press of the world has caught at every word that seems to indicate the success and safety of the brave Norwegian in his dangerous drift voyage toward the North Pole. Dr. Fridtjof Nansen, born in 1861, became famous by crossing, first of all men, the inland ice of Greenland in 1888 from Umivik, 64 degrees 45 minutes north on the east coast, to Kangersunnek Fjord, 50 miles south of Gotthab. Later, he conceived a novel and dangerous plan for polar work. Ignoring the accepted rules of ice navigation, of avoiding besetment and following the protected lee of land masses, he decided to put his ship into the ice to the north of the New Siberian Islands, whence he believed that he would be carried by ocean currents across the pole to the Spitzbergen Sea. His steamer, Fram, 125 feet long, with an oak hull 30 inches thick, and sheathed with greenheart, was built so as to rise under ice pressure, as he claimed. The crew of 12 were provisioned for 5 years, though he expected, by a drift of a little over 2 miles per day, to reach the Atlantic in 2 years. No explorer of experience endorsed the plan, but with undaunted courage Nansen sailed June 24, 1893, and entering the Sea of Kara was last seen to the east of Nova Zembla in September 1893. He visited neither the Timor Peninsula nor the New Siberian Islands, as events have since shown. February 13, 1896, a dispatch from Irkutsk on the authority of Koncharev, an agent of Nansen, stated that the explorer, having reached land masses at the North Pole, was now returning. 2 days later, a dispatch from Archangel confirmed the first report in general terms only. From the beginning, no credit was given to these dispatches by any American Arctic explorer or student. Melville, Schutze, Dall, and the writer were strenuous in disbelief, but the story was credited by scores of persons, both in Europe and this country, who did not find it peculiar that a story from the center of Asia was confirmed from the north of Europe, nor were surprised that such news came from the Siberian Ocean in midwinter. Through the Norwegian press, Nansen's relatives announced their disbelief in this rumor. As to the drift relics found on the west coast of Greenland, which were relied on by Nansen as practical proof that his theory of a drift voyage was correct, it may be said that Melville, the man best qualified to speak about the Jeannette, denied at the time their genuineness and endeavored without avail to have them brought to this country. The writer publicly called Nansen's attention to this question, which for the first time seems to have created doubts in his mind. Nansen made efforts to find the relics for verification, but they had disappeared in toto. While Nansen's journey is exceedingly dangerous, it would not be astonishing if he was able to return from his ship, if it was lost south of 81 degrees north to the Asiatic coast. But if he really approached the North Pole, as is possible, before his vessel was destroyed, it is safe to say that he will pay for an unequaled latitude with his life and carry the secret of his well-earned success to his grave. The numerous errors lately set forth in the press indicate the need of accurate data relative to latitudes attained. The tendency to unfairly present data in the interests of individuals or nations is of constant occurrence, and it is not surprising that the general public should be unfamiliar with all the facts. This is especially true in Arctic matters, as is shown by the North Polar Chart in the Times Atlas, 1895, so much lauded for its fullness and accuracy. On this chart, the highest north of the German, Swedish, and English Paris 1827 expeditions is so described in full by text and latitudes. In the case of Beaumont, the English explorer, his latitude is given as 82 degrees 54 minutes north, which is 33 miles too far north, and his record is spread on the map above that of Lockwood, while the last named explorer, who actually made the highest north ever attained, has not even his latitude entered. In this remarkable case of suppressio veri, an American explorer loses his nationality, his latitude, and his hard-earned record, all other nationalities having their data entered in full. Under these conditions, it seems to be rendering a geographical service to reproduce here a table extracted from a Handbook of Arctic Discovery written by myself. Records of the highest north made since 1587 in the eastern and western hemispheres by land and by sea. Note: this table is reproduced by permission of Roberts Brothers, publishers. End of note. Eastern Hemisphere. Commander William Barents. Date July 14th, 1594. North latitude 77 degrees 20 minutes. Longitude 62 degrees east. Locality near Cape Nassau, Nova Zembla. Commander Riepenheimskirk, Barents' third voyage. Date June 19th, 1596. North latitude 79 degrees 49 minutes. Longitude 12 degrees east. Locality North Spitzbergen. Commander Henry Hudson. Date July 13th, 1607. North latitude 80 degrees 23 minutes. Longitude 10 degrees east. Locality Spitzbergen Sea. Commander J.C. Phipps. Date July 27th, 1773. North latitude 80 degrees 48 minutes. Longitude 20 degrees east. Locality Spitzbergen Sea. Commander William Scoresby. Date May 24th, 1806. North latitude 81 degrees 30 minutes. Longitude 19 degrees east. Locality Spitzbergen Sea. Commander W.E. Parry. Date July 23rd, 1827. North latitude 82 degrees 45 minutes. Longitude 20 degrees east. Locality Spitzbergen Sea. Commander Nordenskjold and Otter. Date September 19th, 1868. North latitude 81 degrees 42 minutes. Longitude 18 degrees east. Locality Spitzbergen Sea, highest by ship. Commander Weyprecht and Peyer. Date April 12th, 1874. North latitude 82 degrees 5 minutes. Longitude 60 degrees east. Locality Franz Josef Land by Peyer, highest land. Western Hemisphere. Commander John Davis. Date June 30th, 1587. North latitude 72 degrees 12 minutes. Longitude 56 degrees west. Locality West Greenland. Commander Henry Hudson. Date June 20th, 1607. North latitude 73 degrees. Longitude 20 degrees west. Locality off East Greenland. Commander William Baffin. Date July 4th, 1616. North latitude 77 degrees 45 minutes. Longitude 72 degrees west. Locality Smith Sound. Commander E. A. Inglefield. Date August 27th, 1852. North latitude 78 degrees 21 minutes. Longitude 74 degrees west. Locality Smith Sound. Commander E. K. Kane. Date June 24th, 1854. North latitude 80 degrees 10 minutes, longitude 67 degrees west. Locality Cape Constitution, Greenland, by Morton. Commander C.F. Hall. Date August 30th, 1870. North latitude 82 degrees 11 minutes, longitude 61 degrees west. Locality Frozen Sea. Commander C.F. Hall. Date June 30th, 1871. North latitude 82 degrees 7 minutes, longitude 59 degrees west. Locality Greenland, by Sergeant Mayer, Signal Corps, U.S. Army. Commander G.S. Nares. Date September 25th, 1875. North latitude 82 degrees 48 minutes, longitude 65 degrees west. Locality Grinnell Land, by Aldrich. Commander G.S. Nares. Date May 12, 1876. North latitude 83 degrees 20 minutes, longitude 65 degrees west. Locality Frozen Sea, by A. H. Markham. Commander A. W. Greely. Date May 13th, 1882. North latitude 83 degrees 24 minutes, longitude 41 degrees west. Locality New Land, north of Greenland, by Lockwood and Brainerd. Doubtless the name of some whaler should follow that of Baffin in the above list, but the inexactitude of most high latitudes reported by whalers is well known. Possibly the reported northing of Lambert, 78½ degrees north, in 1670, on the East Greenland coast, may have exceeded Inglefield's exact latitude of 78 degrees 21 minutes. Sweden holds the ship's record in the Old World, but Parry beat it by boats. It will be noted that England held the honors of the furthest north through Hudson, 1607, Phipps, 1773, Parry, 1827, and Nares by Aldrich, 1875, and by Markham, 1876. This record, unbroken for 275 years, passed to the United States through the efforts of the International Polar Expedition under Lieutenant Greely, which, by Lockwood and Brainerd, reached 83 degrees 24 minutes, the most northerly point, whether on sea or land, ever attained by man, which Nansen or Jackson may possibly excel. Among other high latitudes attained, but not pertinent to this table, are the following: Hayes, about 80 degrees 10 minutes, in 1861. Jackson, 81 degrees 20 minutes, in 1895. Peary, 81 degrees 37 minutes, in 1891 and 1895. Beaumont, 82 degrees 21 minutes, in 1876. Pavey, with Greely, 82 degrees 54 minutes, in 1882, and Aldrich, 83 degrees 7 minutes, in 1876. End of section 2.
Section 3 of The National Geographic Magazine, Volume 7, March 1896. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MaryAnn Spiegel. The Submarine Cables of the World by Gustave Herrle. The English give Professor, afterward Sir, Charles Wheatstone the credit of being the originator of submarine cables, that gentleman having laid before the House of Commons in 1840 a scheme for the laying of a telegraph cable across the channel between Dover and Calais, but his plans did not seem to have been fully matured. In the United States, in 1842, Professor S. F. B. Morse experimented with a submarine cable between Castle Garden and Governor's Island, New York Harbor, and a year later, in detailing the results of his experiments with an electromagnetic telegraph in a letter to the then Secretary of the Treasury, J.C. Spencer, he said, "The practical inference from this law is that a telegraphic communication on the electromagnetic plan may with certainty be established across the Atlantic. Startling as this may seem now, I am confident that the time will come when this project will be realized." It was not, however, until 1850 that the first submarine cable in the open sea was laid. This was the cable across the channel between Dover and Calais. It was made of copper wire, covered with gutta percha to half an inch in diameter. the shore ends of the wire being doubly covered with cotton, overlaid with a coating of India rubber, and the whole enclosed in a thick lead pipe. This cable did not work successfully on account of defective insulation and had to be abandoned. Another authority states that telegraphic communication was maintained for a few hours, when it was suddenly interrupted, the cause being, as was afterwards discovered, the cutting of the cable by a French fisherman, who, it is said, exhibited a piece of it to the astonished people of the neighboring town as a rare specimen of seaweed with its center filled with gold. Be that as it may, to guard against such casualties the new cable, laid in the following year, 1851, between Dover and Calais, was made much stronger, consisting of a wire insulated with gutta percha, and forming a core to a wire rope as a protector. This cable was an entire success, and as a consequence the establishment of a number of short submarine cables in Europe and America followed shortly afterward. In 1854 Mr. Cyrus W. Field, whose memory will ever be dear to the hearts of Americans, took up, in company with American and English capitalists, the project to connect Europe and America by a submarine cable, and on August 7, 1857, the laying of the first Atlantic cable was begun by the U.S. frigate Niagara, which sailed from Valentia, Ireland, in the direction of Heart's Content, Newfoundland. When about 400 miles had been laid, the cable broke and the steamer returned. In the following year, 1858, the attempt was renewed. HMS Agamemnon with one portion of the cable, and the U.S. frigate Niagara with the other portion, meeting in mid-ocean, in about latitude 52 degrees 2 minutes north, longitude 53 degrees 18 minutes west, to splice the cable there, and then to lay it, one ship sailing eastward and the other westward. In this attempt the cable broke and the steamers returned to port, but a sufficient length of the cable being left, another attempt was made later in the year, and the laying was successfully accomplished over the whole distance. America and Europe were united by telegraphic communication on August 5th, and congratulatory messages were exchanged between the two continents. This is what the Queen of England telegraphed to the President of the United States. The Queen desires to congratulate the President upon the successful completion of this great international work, in which the Queen has taken the deepest interest. The Queen is convinced that the President will join with her in fervently hoping that the electric cable which now connects Great Britain with the United States will prove an additional link between the nations whose friendship is founded upon their common interest and reciprocal esteem. The Queen has much pleasure in communicating with the President and renewing to him her wishes for the prosperity of the United States. To this President Buchanan replied as follows: The President cordially reciprocates the congratulations of Her Majesty the Queen on the success of the great international enterprise accomplished by the science, skill, and indomitable energy of the two countries. It is a triumph more glorious, because far more useful to mankind, than was ever won by conqueror on the field of battle. May the Atlantic Telegraph, under the blessing of Heaven, prove to be a bond of perpetual peace and friendship between the kindred nations, and an instrument destined by divine providence to diffuse religion, civilization, liberty, and law throughout the world. In this view will not all nations of Christendom spontaneously unite in the declaration that it shall be for ever neutral, and that its communication shall be held sacred in passing to their places of destination, even in the midst of hostilities? But, alas, the joy over the greatest triumph of the age was destined to be of short duration. In less than a month the cable refused to work, owing to some fault the nature of which could not be definitely ascertained. It was at last abandoned in despair, and no further attempt to lay another one was made until 1864, when the Atlantic Telegraph Company made, with the Telegraph Construction and Maintenance Company, a contract for a new cable between Valencia and Heart's Content, and chartered the steamship Great Eastern to lay it. This cable was 2,273 nautical miles long, and its weight was 300 pounds per mile. Its laying down commenced on July 23, 1865, Mr. Cyrus W. Field being on board the ship, but on August 2nd, after about 1,400 knots had been played out, the cable parted and the broken end disappeared from view. The Great Eastern remained near the scene of the accident until August 11th, when she gave up the attempt to recover the cable and returned to Europe. Thus another hope, another aspiration, was buried, and we may well imagine the feelings of those who had put their faith and their money into the undertaking. The story of this attempt, and of the successful recovery of the lost cable a year later by means of grapnels from a depth of over 2,000 fathoms, forms one of the most interesting chapters in the history of submarine telegraphy. But after all the disheartening failures which had attended the laying of the first 3 Atlantic cables, the indomitable pluck and energy of Mr. Field and his associates were to be finally rewarded with success. A new cable was ordered, and on July 13, 1866, the Great Eastern again started from Valencia, and, without further serious mishap, finished the laying over the whole distance on July 27th, when the cable was spliced to the shore's end at Heart's Content. Moreover, on September 1st following, the Great Eastern recovered the lost cable of the previous year, spliced it to the cable on board, and completed the laying of it towards Heart's Content, thus establishing a duplicate line. Ever since that time we have had uninterrupted telegraph communication with Europe, and this 1866 cable thus became the pioneer of the long-distance, deep-sea cables. Immense progress has since been made in the establishment of submarine telegraph lines. A fleet of between 35 and 40 steamers, specially constructed and equipped for cable service, sprang into existence, and the present total length of the submarine cables of the world is, in round numbers, 160,000 nautical miles, or enough to gird the earth 7½ times at the equator. At an average cost of $1,200 per mile, the entire system represents an outlay of $192 million. Of the total mileage, about 1/8 is under the control of various national governments. The Hydrographic Office issued, in 1892, a book on submarine cables, prepared by Mr. G.W. Littlehales, as a part of the report of that office on the survey made by the U.S. ships Albatross and Thetis for an ocean cable route between San Francisco and Honolulu. It contains a large amount of interesting information, including valuable statistical data, among which is a complete list of the submarine cables of the world, in detail. The tables being much too voluminous for publication in these pages, the following list of the more important cables have been compiled from them, the reader being referred to the original report for information concerning the shorter cables and for more complete data generally. Cables over 400 nautical miles long, operated by governments. France, Marseille to Algiers, 3 cables, 488, 496, and 500. Tenerife to St. Louis, Senegal, 865. Cochin China and Tonkin, Cape St. James to Thuan, Hoi, 530. British India, Memorne to Jask, 531. Jask to Bushire, 2 cables, 519 and 500. Cables over 400 nautical miles long, owned by private companies, also total length of cables operated by each company. Direct Spanish Telegraph Company, total 708, Kennock Cove, Cornwall to Los Arenys, near Bilbao, 487. Halifax and Bermuda Cable Company, Halifax, Nova Scotia to Hamilton, Bermuda, 850. Spanish National Submarine Telegraph Company, total 2,159. Cadiz to Santa Cruz de Tenerife, 864. Tahiti, Tenerife to St. Louis, Senegal, 865. West African Telegraph Company, total 3,015. Kotun to St. Thomas, 468. St. Thomas to Lonada, 760. Great Northern Telegraph Company, Europe and Asia, total 6,932. Newbiggin, England to Arendal, Norway, 424. Newbiggin to Marstrand, Sweden, 510. Newbiggin to Hertshads, Denmark, 420. Amoy to Gustave, China, 590. Gutseov to Nagasaki, Japan, 427. Gutseov to Nagasaki, 416. Nagasaki to Vladivostok, Russia, 2 cables, 753 and 766. Eastern Telegraph Company, total 27,453. Porthcarno, Land's End, England to Lisbon, Portugal, 2 cables, 850 and 802. Portherno to Vigo, Spain, 622. Gibraltar to Malta, 2 cables, 1118 and 1126. Marseille, France to Bona, Algeria, 2 cables, 447 and 463. Trieste, Austria to Corinne, 593. Malta to Alexandria, Egypt, 2 cables, 928 and 911. Suez, Egypt to Suakim, Sondon, 3 cables, 936, 811 and 811. Suez to Aden, 794. Suez to Perim Island, 1331. Suakim to Parent Island, 597. Suakim to Aden, 2 cables, 794 each. Aden to Bombay, 3 cables, 1850, 1859, and 1885. Eastern and South African Telegraph Company, total 6,796, increased since 1892 to 8,841. Aden to Zanzibar, 1,909. Zanzibar to Mozambique, 2 cables, 644 and 685. Mozambique to Lourenço Marques, Delagoa Bay, 970. Cape Town to Port Nolloth, 433. Port Nolloth to Mozambique, 1,652. Eastern Extension, Australasia, and China Telegraph Company, total 17,342. Madras to Penang, 2 cables, 1,462, 1,389. Rangoa to Penang, 864. Singapore to Saigon, Cochin, China, 628. Haiphong, Tonkin to Hong Kong, 470. Fuchan to Hong Kong, 472. Saigon to Hong Kong, 990. Saigon to Thumman An, 516. Hong Kong to Cape Belineo, island of Buksoa, 529. Singapore to Batavia, Java, 541. Singapore to Banjuwangi, Java, 921. Banjuwangi to Port Darwin, Australia, 2 cables, 1,143 and 1,124. Banjuwangi to Roebuck Bay, Australia, 892. Sydney to Nelson, New Zealand, 2 cables, 1,284 and 1,322. Hong Kong to Fuchan, 472. Fuchan to Shanghai, 449. Anglo-American Telegraph Company, total 10,400, increased to 12,290 since 1892. Valentia, Ireland, to Heart's Content, Newfoundland, 3 cables, 1,850, 1,881, and 1,890. Minoa, France, to Saint-Pierre, 2,718. Saint-Pierre to Duxbury, Massachusetts, 809. Direct United States Cable Company, total 3,099. Ballinskelligs Bay, Ireland, to Halifax, 2,564. Halifax to Rye Beach, New Hampshire, 535. Champagne Francais du Telegraphe de Paris à New York, total 3,496. Brest to Saint-Pierre, 2,282. Saint-Pierre to Cape Cod, Massachusetts, 826. Western Union Telegraph Company, total 7,743. Penzance, England to Canso, Nova Scotia, 2 cables, 2,531 and 2,576. Canso to New York, 2 cables, each 888. The Commercial Cable Company, total 6,938, since increased to 9,075. Havre to Waterville, Ireland, 510. Waterville to Canso, 3 cables, 2,138, 2,350, and 2,388. Canso to New York, 841. Canso to Rockport, Massachusetts, 519. Brazilian Submarine Telegraph Company, total 7,369. Lisbon to Madeira, 2 cables, 627 and 631. Madeira to St. Vincent, Cape Verde Island, 2 cables, 1,168 and 1,200. St. Vincent to Pernambuco, Brazil, 2 cables, 1,862 and 1,872. African Direct Telegraph Company, total 2,746. Santiago to Broadhurst, 471. Broadhurst to Sierra Leone, 463. Sierra Leone to Accra, 1,020. Cuba Submarine Telegraph Company, total 1,590. Cienfuegos to Santiago, Cuba, 3 cables, 400, 420, and 420. West India and Panama Telegraph Company, total 4,577. Kingston, Jamaica to Colon, Panama Isthmus, 630. Holland Bay to San Juan, Puerto Rico, 683. Holland Bay to Ponce, Puerto Rico, 647. St. Croix to Port of Spain, Trinidad, 541. Société Française du Télégraphe sous-Marin, total 3,754, since increased to 4,544. Puerto Plata, Santo Domingo to Port-de-France, Martinique, 787. Fort-de-France to Paramaribo, Dutch Guinea, 777. Cayenne to Vinçu, Brazil, 662. Santo Domingo to Curaçao, 453. Western and Brazilian Telegraph Company, total 3,964, since increased to 6,144. Maranham to Ceará, Brazil, 406. Ceará to Pernambuco, 476. Bahia to Rio de Janeiro, 837. Mexican Telegraph Company, total 1,523. Galveston, Texas to Tampico, Mexico, 400. Galveston to Coatzacoalcos, Mexico, 822. Central and South American Telegraph Company, total 7,496. Salina Cruz, Mexico to Libertad, Salvador, 431. San Juan del Sur de Panama, 721. Bonaventura to St. Elena, Ecuador, 486. Piata to Callao Lima, Peru, 553. Callao Lima to Iquique, Chile, 747. Iquique to Valparaiso, Chile, 877. West Coast of America Telegraph Company, total 1,699, since increased to 1,964. Callao Lima to Mollendo, Peru, 510. Note on compilation of chart. This chart, see frontispiece, was compiled in the U.S. Hydrographic Office from the latest information and is a facsimile of HO chart number 1530 just issued by that office. The 12 cables across the North Atlantic Ocean were plotted from their terminal points on the American continent to meridian 40 degrees west, from positions furnished by the respective cable companies, with the exception of 3, the Western Union of 1881 and 1882, and the Mackay-Bennett of 1894, for which positions were furnished all the way across. From the European terminal points to meridian 40 degrees west, the cables, with the exceptions just mentioned, were plotted from information deposited in the Office of Naval Intelligence. A map furnished by the Western Union Telegraph Company was used for the plotting of the principal connecting land lines in the United States. The cables and land lines of Japan were taken chiefly from the outline map of Japan, showing the principal post, telegraph, and railway routes published by the Japanese Department of Communications in 1888, and which accompanies a concise dictionary of the principal roads and chief towns and villages of Japan by W. N. Whitney, M.D., formerly interpreter of the U.S. Legation at Tokyo. The other cables and land lines of the world were taken chiefly from the Carte des Communications, Telegraphie du Régime extra-européen des réseaux du prêt, des documents officiels pour le Bureau international d'administration télégraphique, Bern, 1888. The coaling, docking, and repairing stations of the world, and their different grades of facilities, were compiled mainly from a publication of the Office of Naval Intelligence entitled Coaling, Docking, and Repairing Facilities of the Ports of the World, 1892, and corrections thereto up to December 1895, and from the British Dock Book of 1894. End of section 3.
Section 4 of The National Geographic Magazine, Volume 7, March 1896. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MaryAnn. Peter Cooper and Submarine Telegraphy. In presenting to its readers a chart of the submarine telegraph cables of the world, the National Geographic magazine was unwilling that this graphic representation of intercontinental communication should be unaccompanied by some reference to one of its earliest and most effective pioneers, the late Peter Cooper. It is well to recall to the rising generation its indebtedness to Mr. Cooper for his eminent services in fostering the initiation of the now elaborate network between the widely separated continents of the earth. With considerable reluctance and only after repeated urging, one of the actors in this great work, the Honorable Abram S. Hewitt, has outlined in a letter all too brief the part played by Mr. Cooper. The letter is as follows. The story of the Atlantic cable has been so fully and so well told by the Rev. Henry M. Field in his History, published in 1892 by Messrs. Scribner and Sons of this city, that only the briefest outline is necessary to call public attention to the origin of an enterprise which, at the time of its inception, was regarded with incredulity, and whose prosecution and final success have all the elements of a romance. My first knowledge of the enterprise was in 1854, when Mr. Cyrus W. Field invited Mr. Peter Cooper and other gentlemen to listen to the propositions of Frederick N. Gisborne, who had come to New York for the purpose of interesting capital in constructing a line of telegraph across Newfoundland, so as to get the news at Cape Race from the European steamers and transmit it thence overland to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and thence by fast steamers to the Cape of Breton, whence land lines had been constructed connecting with our American system. In that interview no suggestion was made for a cable across the Gulf of St. Lawrence, because it was doubtful at that time whether submarine communication of such length could be established and maintained. The amount of money required was not very considerable, and the gentlemen appealed to, being all men of large views, came to the conclusion that they would contribute to the amount, not so much as a commercial speculation as from consideration of the advantage of early news in business transactions affecting the two continents. The Newfoundland Company was organized, with Mr. Cooper as its president and Mr. Field as its active manager. The other gentlemen concerned in the undertaking were Moses Tyler, Marshall O. Roberts, Chandler W. White, and, at a later period, Wilson G. Hunt. David Dudley Field also took an interest and was legal adviser of the company. Arrangements were made for the construction of the land line without delay, and later, when the experience of the European submarine cables established the practicability of longer lines, it was decided to lay the cable across the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a distance of about 80 miles. The first attempt to lay this cable was a failure, owing to the imperfect arrangements for transporting the cable across the Gulf, and the occurrence of a storm, which caused the severance of the cable when the vessel engaged in laying it was midway between the two termini. It was determined, however, to renew the attempt, and in the following year a cable was successfully laid, and the original plan of the company for intercepting news at Cape Race was carried into effect. As a matter of course, the enterprise was not a commercial success, but its advantages were so apparent that the parties in interest concluded that the time had come to make the attempt to continue the cable from Newfoundland to the coast of Ireland. The idea was a daring one, but the highest electrical authorities concurred in opinion that it was feasible. Mr. Field proceeded to England to organize a company in which he succeeded, and which resulted in the attempt to lay the cable in 1857, made by the Agamemnon on the British side and by the Niagara on the American side. I need not rehearse the story of the successive failures, but the first one occurred in 1857 during the panic of that year, which spread wide ruin throughout the country. Among others, Mr. Field was compelled to succumb, and it seemed probable that any further attempt to construct and lay the cable would be abandoned. It was at this juncture that the strong common sense and unshaken faith of Peter Cooper came into play. When the financial storm had abated, he urged Mr. Field to undertake the resuscitation of the enterprise, and he offered to advance, and actually did advance, the money required for Mr. Field's expenditures until such time as the success of the cable might be demonstrated and assured. Some of the other gentlemen declined to participate in these advances, and hence the burden upon Mr. Cooper was very onerous, and gave great concern to his family. Nevertheless, Mr. Field soon recovered his confidence, and with indomitable courage and indefatigable industry, he finally succeeded in accomplishing the difficult undertaking with which his name and fame are justly identified. So far as Mr. Cooper and his family were concerned, they did what they could to secure the success of the enterprise, and I think it may be justly asserted that, without Mr. Cooper's assistance and absolute faith in the final success of the undertaking, its realization would have been postponed for many years. In the end he was fully indemnified and perhaps amply rewarded for his investment, but without detracting in the slightest from the credit which is justly accorded to Mr. Field, I think I am justified in making, at your request, this brief statement in order to show that without the unflinching courage and cooperation of Mr. Cooper, Mr. Field would hardly have been in a position to achieve the triumph which he finally secured, and for which his memory is entitled to the veneration of succeeding generations. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 7, March 1896. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Russo-American Telegraph Project of 1864-67 by Professor William H. Dall. The possibility of constructing a line of telegraph overland through Siberia and northwestern America had doubtless occurred to many, but the first person to endeavor to give practical effect to the conception appears to have been Mr. Perry M. Collins of California, who in 1856 and for some years subsequently was United States consular agent at Nikolaevsk on the Amur River in eastern Siberia. By dint of constant activity and perseverance, Mr. Collins succeeded in obtaining the concessions necessary to the construction of the line of telegraph, with all needful accessories, from the Amur to the British Columbian line through eastern Siberia and the Russian-American colonies, and also through the British territories in America. Continual mishaps in the course of the attempts to lay a workable cable across the Atlantic had led many telegraphers to believe that the plan was impracticable, though they had no doubt of their ability to construct and keep in working order shorter lines, such as that proposed across Bering Strait. The propositions of Mr. Collins were laid before the directors of the Western Union Telegraph Company, March 16, 1864. They accepted, by a unanimous vote, the transfer of his rights and interests, and on March 18th completed an organization for the carrying out of the project. An expedition to explore the proposed route, under Colonel Charles S. Bulkley, formerly of the United States Military Telegraph Corps, was immediately organized. Colonel Bulkley reached the Pacific coast in January 1865. The exploration of the British Columbian line was directed by Edmund Conway, that of the Russian-American by Robert Kennicott, and that of eastern Siberia by Sergius Abasa. The United States detailed Captain C. M. Scammon of the Revenue Marine Service and 2 other officers to the fleet fitted out by the company, and the Russian government lent the aid of the corvette Vzadnik. The first visit was paid to the Russian authorities at Sitka in March 1865. In July, parties were on the way to Siberia, Alaska, and the Bering Strait. Explorations during this and the following season demonstrated the practicability of the route selected and saw a small amount of line constructed, every endeavor being made to carry out the project. In 1867, the Atlantic cable at last proved itself a working success. On the other hand, the experience gained by the expeditions sent out in connection with the Russo-American project showed that the maintenance of the projected line would be so expensive as to make it impossible for it to compete with the Atlantic cable commercially. Consequently, the company decided to withdraw from the enterprise, and in the autumn of 1867 the parties returned to California. The route chosen was up the valley of the Fraser River in British Columbia and down the Yukon to the Nulato Bend, thence across country to Port Clarence, where a cable was to connect with the Siberian lines. The latter would leave the Chukchi Peninsula, cross the neck of the peninsula of Kamchatka, and skirt the shores of the Okhotsk Sea, joining the Russian lines at Nikolaevsk. It is stated that a large part of the $14 millions represented by the stock was actually expended in the work. At all events, a large amount of money was spent, and the only returns were those public benefits implied by an increase of geographical and other scientific knowledge and the training of a number of explorers and investigators. End of section 5.
Section 6 of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 7, March 1896. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Survey and Subdivision of Indian Territory by Henry Gannett, Chief Topographer, United States Geological Survey. The condition of things in Indian Territory is anomalous. The territory is an area of some 31,000 square miles, divided among what are called the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, the reservation of each tribe being owned by the tribe. Such a thing as private ownership of land is unknown. Each individual entitled to do so is, however, permitted to take up and occupy any land which is not already occupied, but in so doing he does not acquire title. The population of the territory consists of some 50,000 Indians, a few whites who have married Indian women and have thus acquired membership in the tribe, with the accompanying privileges and emoluments, a few thousand Negroes, mostly the descendants of slaves, and a large number, variously estimated at from 100,000 to 200,000, of whites who are living in the territory on sufferance, some legally upon the payment of a small tax, others without the shadow of right or authority. These latter are known as interlopers. As might be expected under this condition of affairs, the whites who have married Indian women, being much shrewder and more experienced than the Indians, have acquired by the right of occupation nearly all the landed property which is worth having in the territory. They own, if it can be called owning, all the best farming and grazing land, all the timber land which is of immediate value, all the town sites, and all the mineral land which is worth having. And by leasing this property to whites, they are rapidly acquiring great wealth. Although in many respects quite advanced in the arts of civilization, the governments established by these Indians are weak and insufficient. So far as the control of the Indians themselves is concerned, they may have ample power, but at present they are called on to cope with and control a large body of whites, outnumbering themselves at least 3 to 1, and composed largely of the rough, lawless frontier element. Indeed, were not the tribal governments reinforced by the power of the United States courts, the territory would long ago have been in a state of anarchy. This situation of affairs, instead of improving with time, is rapidly becoming worse, inasmuch as the number of interlopers in the territory is constantly and rapidly increasing. The remedy for this threatening aspect of affairs is plainly the substitution of a territorial government by all inhabitants for the present tribal governments of the Indian minority, the allotment of land to the Indians, and the consequent establishment of land titles. Foreseeing the necessity of this solution, Congress has for the past 2 years been endeavoring to treat with the tribes to accept their lands in severalty. In pursuance of this object, 2 different commissions have been appointed, each of which has spent several months in the territory endeavoring to obtain a hearing from the tribes, but thus far without the slightest result. The tribes have declined absolutely to treat with them upon this subject. During the progress of these attempts at negotiation, Congress has taken another step in the same direction. In March 1895, an appropriation of $200,000 was made by Congress for commencing the survey and subdivision of the lands of the territory, being the necessary preliminary step toward allotment. This work was placed by the Secretary of the Interior in the hands of the Director of the Geological Survey, instead of being let out on contract, as has been done in all cases of subdivision heretofore. The Chickasaw Nation was accepted, as it was subdivided in 1873. The work was commenced in April under the following plan. The Indian baseline, which forms the baseline of the Chickasaw Nation and of Oklahoma, was adopted for carrying the work into the other nations. The second guide meridian, east of the principal meridian of the Chickasaw Nation, was run northward and southward as a principal meridian for the other nations. Thus, while the general system of surveys conforms to that in the Chickasaw Nation and in Oklahoma, the work has been so planned as to make it independent of any errors which may have accumulated in the earlier work. 2 parties have been engaged continuously since April last in running standard lines, guide meridians, and correction lines, by which the country is divided into blocks 24 miles on a side. The township exteriors were run by distinct parties, 2 parties being at first organized for this work, which were subsequently increased to 4. The subdivision of townships into sections was carried on by still a 3rd set of parties, 8 of which were organized and placed in the field during the month of May, and the number was subsequently increased to 16. Thus, the entire work of subdividing the land is carried on by 3 distinct sets of parties, the work of each checking that of another. Furthermore, a system of triangulation has been carried over the area subdivided, and the stations in this triangulation have been connected with section and township corners. This is done not only for the purpose of checking and correcting errors, but also to form reference points for the recovery of missing corners, the triangulation points being marked in a very permanent manner. The triangulation rests upon a baseline measured on the track of the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway near Savannah, and the astronomical position of this place was determined as the initial position. The subdivision parties, by which is to be understood the parties engaged in running the section lines, are grouped, 4 of them being in charge of an experienced surveyor connected with the Permanent Corps of the United States Geological Survey, who supervises the work closely and attends to the executive management of the outfit, and who, moreover, commonly with the aid of an assistant, maps the topography of the area subdivided. This latter duty is rendered light by the fact that the surveyor in running the lines locates the points of crossing of every stream, road, or other natural or artificial feature which he encounters in the course of his line. Thus, at intervals of a mile or less, all the features are located, and little remains for the topographer to do except to sketch these features between these points of location. The progress made in this survey up to the end of January of the present year is set forth in a report which has been made to the Secretary of the Interior. It appears from this that in the primary triangulation 49 stations have been selected, signals built upon them, and angles measured from them. By means of these stations, an area of about 10,000 square miles, or about 5/12 of the area of the territory, excluding the Chickasaw Nation, has been controlled. In the subdivision work, 11,770 miles had been run out of an estimated amount of 47,000 miles to complete the territory, or about 1/4 of the entire work. Of the above mileage, 970 miles are of standard lines, that is, standard parallels and correction lines. 1,790 miles are exterior lines of townships. 8,770 miles are section lines, and the remaining 240 miles are the meander lines of streams. The work thus far done completes the subdivision of 128 full townships and 26 fractional townships. It is included mainly in the western part of the Choctaw Nation, embraces all of the Seminole country and some of the Creek country, while standard lines have been run into the Cherokee Nation. The progress is represented upon the sketch map accompanying this paper. The mapping of topography has followed closely after the work of subdivision, and up to the date given above, an area of 4,200 square miles had been thus mapped. End of section 6. Section 7 of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 7, March 1896. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Free Burghs in the United States. Note by James H. Blodgett, late Special Agent of Census in charge of Education. 3 bridges across the Potomac River connect the District of Columbia with the state of Virginia. The upper one, known as the Chain Bridge, just below the Little Falls, the head of tidewater, is too far from dense population to be frequented by foot passengers. 3 miles below the Chain Bridge is the Aqueduct Bridge, practically the head of navigation, since only small pleasure boats and scows to bring stone from the quarries go above it. Along the Virginia shore, above the Aqueduct Bridge, are various resort houses, more or less permanent, ostensibly for legitimate relaxation and pleasure, but viewed with suspicion by the authorities on both sides of the river, justified by results of occasional raids by officials. At the Virginia end of the same bridge is a straggling group of houses known as Roslyn, a favorite place for those who want to go beyond the police restraints of the District of Columbia, and particularly for those interested in the gambling device known as policy, a sort of lottery especially attractive to the colored people. Between the Aqueduct Bridge and the Long Bridge, 2 miles or more farther down, at the upper extreme of dense habitation, the low ground on the Virginia side is brushy, with but few houses, and is a rambling place for various kinds of boys and men who find the towpath of the abandoned canal a convenient footway. The highlands contain the government reservation, comprising Fort Myer and the Arlington National Cemetery. Close to the Virginia end of the historic Long Bridge are a few houses known as Jackson City. Freedom from rigid police control has made this a convenient place for gambling in various forms. Close by, known as Alexander's Island, is maintained irregularly a racecourse. 3 miles farther is another racecourse known as St. Asaph. Note: this article, written for the National Geographic Magazine, is less technical and has less of legal citation and quotation of authorities than a paper bearing the same title read before the Anthropological Society of Washington, November 5, 1895. The latter, valuable for purposes of reference and verification, will be printed by the American Historical Association. End note. A good part of the racing in sight of the Capitol has been that known as outlaw racing, that is, with horses or with jockeys not in good standing with the regular racing associations. Just below St. Asaph is the city of Alexandria, which is popularly regarded as a part of Alexandria County, to share whatever of good or bad repute attaches to it. At the census of 1790, all this vicinity was part of Fairfax County, except that Alexandria already had a separate court and was exempt from county taxes. For the organization of the District of Columbia, Virginia ceded to the general government the jurisdiction, note, over a tract bounded by the line extending 10 miles northwest from the mouth of Hunting Creek, a line northeast from the terminus of the first, and the river, containing an area said to be 32 square miles. In 1801, Congress erected the area ceded by Virginia into a county, to be called Alexandria County, but expressly retaining for Alexandria all existing chartered rights. In 1846, the United States receded the tract to Virginia, which has continued to be generally known as Alexandria County, though the policy of separation of city and county, suspended for half a century, has been renewed. The combined population of city and county in 1890 was 18,597, of which 14,339 persons were in the city of Alexandria, which is not a part of Alexandria County, although its name, its vicinity, its recent affinity with the county, and the presence of the county buildings, note, tend with most persons to make the residents municipally responsible for the unlawful conduct nearby. Many persons, while rejoicing in the measure of success attained, do not see why the energetic governor of Virginia sent officers to break up disreputable practices in the county. They do not appreciate the weakness of the real Alexandria County when the gambling elements of the neighboring cities flow out upon it. It has but a little over 4,000 population, 1890, of whom, after deducting 164 on the military reservation, over one half, 2,123, are of Negro descent and not yet of much proprietary responsibility. Alexandria is but an example of the cities of Virginia from the earliest days. James City, better known as Jamestown, and now extinct, was established as the chief city in 1639. Williamsburg was set apart as a city to be used for no other purpose whatever, and defined as the capital in 1699, and again in 1705, in advance of population. Note 1. The ownership remained in the existing proprietors. Certain authors erroneously state that the title or possession was transferred. Note 2. A bill is pending for erection of county buildings outside of the city. End of notes. There was a general plan to put in each county a similar town for commercial purposes, especially for warehousing and marketing tobacco. Norfolk, chartered as a borough in 1737, has lost that name, but its relations to the county are today like those of the original charter, gradually defined, strengthened, and confirmed in points of dispute, in favor of the municipality. At first, the Norfolk County buildings were in Norfolk, and a special clause in the charter reserved proprietary rights in them to the county. Later legislation authorized their sale and the erection of county buildings outside of Norfolk. The buildings are now in Portsmouth. In 1776, many boroughs which had been given separate representation in the Assembly were cut off by a law which prescribed that no borough with a population less, for 7 successive years, than half that of any county should be separately represented. In the same year, the delegate for William and Mary College, specified in its charter, was cut off. In the state law for apportionment of members of Congress, 1892, the following names of cities are given separate from names of counties. 1st District, Fredericksburg. 2nd, Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Williamsburg. 3rd, Richmond and Manchester. 4th, Petersburg. 5th, Danville and the town of North Danville. 6th, Lynchburg, Radford, and Roanoke. 7th, Charlottesville and Winchester. 8th, Alexandria. 9th, Bristol. 10th, Stanton. To these are to be added Buena Vista in the 10th District, chartered on the day of the approval of the Apportionment Bill, and Newport News, for which the bill was signed January 18, 1896. The conditions for the town of North Danville are in transition. It has been a town independent of Pittsylvania County, but judicially dependent on Danville. The name has recently been changed to Neapolis, and just too late for insertion here, it will be determined by popular vote whether it shall be consolidated with Danville. Note: in early days there was a disposition in certain other colonies to establish cities independent of counties. In New Jersey and in Maryland, such early independencies as survived came under county control. In Pennsylvania, the claims of Germantown to independence of the taxation of Philadelphia County were overruled by the governor. In Virginia, from the incorporation of James City, 1639, it has been the steady policy to have the cities independent of the counties. Note: by popular vote on February 20th, Neapolis is to become a part of Danville on July 1st, 1896. End note. It confuses some students to find an occasional participation of urban residents and rural residents in local affairs, but on examination of charters it will be found that this extends only to subjects expressly named in any instance. If one will examine the scheme of government for the city and county of St. Louis, Missouri, 1876, he will find that all power of county officers was abrogated. The same act restored their power for the rural portion, now St. Louis County, leaving the city to be provided with a separate government in the same act. The situation in Virginia may be clearer if the legislature is deemed to have abolished all county authority in any city under consideration, and then to have restored by name such items of power as circumstances demanded. The present cities of Virginia have the following characteristics. The code defines a city as a town having over 5,000 inhabitants and a hustings court, and defines a town as an incorporated town having less than 5,000 population. Note: the cities have distinct courts. Their citizens do not pay county taxes on city property. They do not serve on county juries. Deeds and other papers affecting city property are recorded by city officers and not by county officers. Generally, residents of cities do not participate in county elections. Exceptionally, they may hold county offices. More exceptionally, they may vote for county officers. Generally, city police courts have jurisdiction 1 mile beyond corporate limits. Exceptionally, there is a limited concurrent jurisdiction of city and county courts, as over waters adjacent to the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth and to Norfolk County. Generally, the county and the city have each a set of public buildings within their respective borders. Exceptionally, authority is given to a county for buildings in a city, as when, at the chartering of the city of Manchester, Chesterfield County was authorized to continue to use its public buildings therein till other arrangements could be made. This authority sometimes embraces arrangement for joint occupancy, as when Norfolk County was authorized to arrange with the city of Portsmouth for the location and construction of a jail. Generally, a county officer may not serve writs in a city. Note: the venerable city of Williamsburg has a smaller population, but its site is expressly set apart for a city. End note. Exceptionally, he can serve writs in the city on residents of his county, as witnesses may be summoned for Campbell County in the city of Lynchburg. Except for individually specified purposes, county and city are as distinct as two counties. The city of Newport News, Virginia, was organized January 20th, 1896, under a charter naming officers to serve till July. The charter contains the following paragraph. 115. The city of Newport News, its real and personal property, and other subjects of taxation, and its inhabitants, shall be exempt from all assessments and levies in the way of taxes imposed by the authorities of Warwick County for any purpose whatever, except upon property owned in the said county by the inhabitants of said city, from and after the 1st day of January, 1896, nor shall said inhabitants be liable to serve upon juries or work upon roads in said county, except in such cases as are provided for by the laws of the state. This extract states an exemption of residents in cities from county taxes and from duty on county juries prevalent in the state. The present facts regarding the cities of Virginia are little known beyond the state. The Congressional Directory is conspicuous as a public document out of the state that shows the cities separately. The Civil Service Commission has found it necessary to recognize the certificate of an officer of a city court of record for Baltimore, St. Louis, and the cities of Virginia where a certificate from a county court was contemplated. A list of cities in Virginia paying no county taxes occurs in the report of the 10th Census, 1880, Volume 7, page 117. Ordinarily, in this country, a city is part of a county. It is set apart that a dense population may establish new values and impose new taxes to meet special demands for public welfare. It continues to pay county taxes. The difficulty of harmonious action by sparse and dense populations upon subjects common to them has led to exceptional separation of cities from counties. Baltimore, Maryland, by successive steps, culminating in 1823, and St. Louis, Missouri, through popular vote in 1876. These two instances are explained in the Johns Hopkins University Studies in Historical and Political Science, Local Institutions of Maryland in Volume 3, and City Government of St. Louis in Volume 5, the latter being most minute and constituting a monograph in itself, and yet the existence of cities independent of county control and of county taxes is denied in certain histories and works on civil government used in high schools, colleges, and universities. In many states, the administration of the public schools is largely through municipalities, charged with that work and superimposed upon areas occupied by other municipalities charged with other interests. There is a very general tendency to charter school districts independent of the town in the north or of the county at the south. In some states, this method of enabling a community to do what the larger unit of which it has been part is not ready to do bids fair to increase. This form of legislation is more common in the West and South than in the Northeast. The forms which these educational municipalities assume are numerous, and the complications produced are often intricate. The complications are probably most intricate in those states formed of the public domain which have township organization, a modified form of the town government of New England. It will be most convenient to limit illustration to the organizations which possess taxing powers, disregarding subdivisions made simply for details of administration of a larger unit, like a voting precinct as a division of a county without taxing power. National, state, and county taxes bear upon property owners throughout the country, with the exception of county taxes in St. Louis, Baltimore, and cities of Virginia, as already explained. The national taxes are so largely collected on goods in bulk before their distribution that most consumers either do not recognize them or persuade themselves that somebody else pays them. Below the county tax come the multitudes of variations. The Congressional Township of the Land Survey, 6 miles square, in its simplest organization, became a school township, a plan encouraged by the grant to the state of a section or of 2 sections or square miles in a township for school purposes. This school corporation is often subdivided into districts, each with its taxing power. There are instances of superimposed incorporation of the town as a high school district with taxing power. Turning from school administration, we find the same area made a civil township, with care of roads, the poor, and other subjects. Within this township may grow up a compact body of population, to be chartered as a village, a town, or a city, according to circumstances, with taxing power for police and other purposes. In some instances, like Springfield, Illinois, these units will assume the charge of schools. In others, like Aurora, Illinois, the city does not administer the schools, which remain under the districts into which the school township was divided. A citizen may therefore find himself under 3 sets of taxes for schools, the township and the district for common schools, and the high school township for its specialty. He may have in addition the civil township tax and the corporation tax. When the school district is given a charter making it independent of its town, the succession of taxes is modified. A volume would hardly suffice to instance all the variations and combinations of duties of the taxpayer in different states, or even in different parts of the same state, growing out of the separately chartered taxing powers and their limited independencies. The cities of Washington, D.C., which has practically absorbed Washington County and become identified with the District of Columbia, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New York, Brooklyn, January 1st, 1896, New York, New Orleans, Louisiana, coextensive with Philadelphia, New York, and Kings counties and Orleans Parish, respectively, but continuing to exercise some functions of counties, and San Francisco, California, identical with San Francisco County, represents simply a growth by which cities have filled county boundaries and not an independence of counties. End of section 7. Section 8 of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 7, March 1896. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Geographic Literature, Obituary, Miscellanea. The receipt at a somewhat late hour of 2 important articles published in this number of the magazine has necessitated the holding over until April of the entire department of Geographic Literature. Obituary. General John Gibbon, a distinguished officer and gallant soldier, died in Baltimore, February 6th. Graduating at the United States Military Academy in 1847, he rose to be a brigadier general in the regular army and a major general of volunteers. Alike against the Seminoles in Florida and the Nez Perce and Sioux in the Northwest, in the Mexican War and in the War for the Union, he served with conspicuous gallantry, winning distinction whether he was in command of a regiment, a brigade, a division, or an army corps. The most desperate battles of the Army of the Potomac found him at the front, and he was severely wounded both at Fredericksburg and Gettysburg. As a man, General Gibbon was greatly respected, and the National Geographic Society deplores in his death the loss of a valuable member, who in the course of 45 years of active service had gained a practical knowledge of the geography of the United States, such as few men have the opportunity of acquiring. Miscellanea. No one unacquainted with Professor W. H. Dall's earlier work as an explorer would imagine from the reading of his modest article on pages 110 and 111 that he himself bore an important and honorable part in one of the expeditions to which he refers. To all, however, except the younger generation, this fact is well known, as is the further fact that Professor Dall's continued explorations and researches in Alaska and the North Pacific Ocean for the long period of 30 years have led to his recognition as one of the best informed men of the time on all matters relating to that most interesting and increasingly important section of the globe. After the abandonment of the overland telegraph project in 1867, Mr. Dall remained for some time in Russian America, witnessing its transformation into Alaska as the result of its purchase by the United States. On his return, he published numerous articles of great scientific value, and in 1870 appeared his well-known work on Alaska and its resources. As an assistant in the U.S. Coast Survey from 1871 to 1874, he devoted himself largely to Alaskan studies, making repeated visits to the far north and publishing from time to time the results of his investigations concerning it. In 1884, he joined the U.S. Geological Survey, of which he has since remained an officer. He is also closely identified with the Smithsonian Institution, of which he is an honorary curator. The proposal to establish a permanent directorship-in-chief of scientific bureaus and investigations in the Department of Agriculture, to give coordination and continuity to the many-sided scientific work of the department, and to complete the good work done by the present secretary in protecting the scientific force from the onslaught of the political spoilsmen, has excited great interest in the scientific world, and called forth a very notable expression of favorable opinion from a large number of eminent scientists and scientific educators. Within a brief period, in fact, since February 18th, President Gilman and the faculty of Johns Hopkins, President Dwight and the scientific faculty of Yale, President Sherman of Cornell, President Lowe of Columbia, President Adams of Wisconsin, President Francis A. Walker of the Boston Institute of Technology, Dr. Shaler, Dean of the Lawrence Scientific School at Harvard, Dr. John S. Billings of New York, the Joint Commission of the Scientific Societies of Washington, and the presidents and other officers of various state universities and colleges have given the proposal the very strongest endorsement. While the recommendation is scarcely likely to be favorably acted upon at the present session of Congress, it is too obviously a step in the direction of a more effective and at the same time more economical administration, too manifestly in the interest of good government in general for its adoption to be long delayed. A preliminary announcement of the Mexican census of 1895 gives a total population of 12,542,057, as against 9,908,011 at the census of 1879, and 11,632,924 as officially estimated in 1889. The population of the principal cities is said to be as follows: City of Mexico, 339,935. Puebla, 91,917. Guadalajara, 83,870. San Luis Potosi, 69,676. Monterrey, 56,835. Merida, 56,702. Pachuca, 52,188. Durango, 42,166. And Zacatecas, 40,026. End of Section 8. End of the National Geographic Magazine, Volume 7, March, 1896.